When it comes to canning homemade pickles, the #1 complaint that I get from people is their pickles are soggy and they're not crunchy. And nobody likes to have a soggy pickle. I'm gonna be sharing with you my secrets because you absolutely can have a crispy, crunchy, canned pickle that is shelf stable on the shelves and lasts for an entire year without being super soggy. The key is 1, picking your cucumbers in the morning before the heat of day or later in the evening. And it's also making sure that you get them at the right size before they are overripe and a good pickling variety. So here, this one is one of the perfect size, just beginning to form here. I could let this guy go a little bit longer, but one of the things I look for is right now you've got like these pokey little ridges. And that's what you really want to see. Once it becomes bloated and more smooth and it's not spiny and doesn't have ridges on it, then that means that it's actually overripe. So you want to pick them in the morning when they are small. Here's another one. And you'll also start to see them begin to turn from kind of this darker green color. Now this lighter green is totally fine, but if they start to get bloated and more of like a yellow color, that is also a sign that they are overripe. Now the next key is as soon as they are harvested, we need to get these treated as soon as possible. And you do have a couple of options, so let's head back to the kitchen. So once you pick your cucumbers, it is crucial that you either A, get them into the fridge immediately upon picking if you don't have enough to do a jar or at least a couple of jars. I have to be honest, I kind of hate to set up and do all the work of canning for just one jar. So if this was the only amount of cucumbers that I had where it wouldn't even do a jar, I would just actually do a jar of fermented pickles rather than getting all the canning stuff out, which we'll make sure and link to beneath this video if you want to learn how to do fermented garlic dill pickles. But when it comes to canning, so that you have them shelf stable without the aid of the fridge, and you have enough to go ahead and do a batch, as soon as you get these picked, you want to bring them in the house and then immediately get them into a ice saltwater bath. So these I prepped yesterday, and there's a couple of things you need to know when it comes to prepping them, and that is we want to remove the blossom end from our cucumbers. There's actually an enzyme that resides in the blossom end, and if you leave that on, it will soften the cucumber and it makes softer cucumbers. So immediately upon rinsing these off, I go ahead and get those prepped, and the blossom end is usually the end that is lighter in color. So if you bought these from the store per se and you're like, well, I don't know which is the blossom end because I didn't pick them, or the stem isn't still on them, you can see here's the stem and then it's darker green, and the blossom end is lighter in color. So that's an easy way to tell if the blossoms or the stems still aren't attached. And now you can see, like, I really can't bend this cucumber at all. These are older cucumbers, and yes, the blossom is still attached here, but these have been on the counter, and like I can actually like wiggle this back and forth. So if you are buying pickling cucumbers from somewhere and you want to make sure, like, once this cucumber is this soft and wiggly, it's never going to create a crisp pickle again. You can't really crisp them back up once they begin to get this limp and soft. So that's something that you want to remember, so that you're testing these. If you're buying them at the store or from a farmer's market or somewhere, test them and make sure that they're feeling firm to the touch if you want to make them for pickles. Now, it's not a complete loss if they are soft like this. This is when I will chop them up and I'll use them in like a relish recipe where I'm not really concerned about them staying nice and crunchy. So we're going to go ahead and remove about a 1/4 inch on the blossom end. And then I usually just go ahead, in case there's a little bit of dirt around the stem. If you're not growing them vertically and they're on the ground, you can get a little bit of dirt around the stem there. So I just kind of been in the habit. I do grow them vertically now and have for the past several years, but I usually just go ahead and remove that end as well. And that allows, the reason that we put these in an ice water, salt water bath is the salt helps to draw out the excess moisture inside the cucumber. And I know that kind of sounds funny, but that is going to help give you a crisper cucumber when you can it. And so the ice, of course, is the temperature. So I fill mine up with ice and just mix the salt water. And we will have a printed version of this so that you have exact measurements on my blog. So we'll have the link below there. You can search melissaknorris.com for garlic dill pickles, and we'll have exact ratios in there. But it's important that it's salt water and it stays really cold. So after you get this in the ice water that has the salt, you're going to let these soak anywhere from 12 up to a few days in the fridge. And you can keep adding that ice water to keep them really cool. Usually I will just do it for 12 hours and then go ahead and make them. But if you have small amounts of a harvest coming in and you really want to can them, then you can just keep putting them in the salt ice water bath until you have enough to do at least a couple of jars. Okay, so after this, and now I realize that I just put the ones I just picked in here. So of course, those cucumbers have not been soaking in this for 12 hours, but these have been actually at 18 hours since I picked them and put them in this bath yesterday evening. So you want to make sure that you drain these and rinse them in cold water well. Otherwise, they can get too salt flavored when you actually go to process them. So we're going to take this over to the sink, get these rinsed well, and then let them drain while we walk through preparing our brine. And you can see I use the Redmond's real salt. It's all I use for fermenting and canning. You want to make sure you're using a canning salt that doesn't have any caking agents in it, and this doesn't. But because it has all of the minerals still in there, there's a little bit of that red-pink sediment, totally normal, but we're going to go ahead and rinse that off because we don't want extra salt and making them too salty where they're not palatable. So as our cucumbers are draining, now we want to go ahead and get our brine prepared. And this is where safety comes into factor as well as flavor. So whenever you're doing a canned pickle that's not a refrigerated pickle, you want to make sure that one, the brine recipe that you are using is an actual canning safe, calculated for a pH of 4.6 or lower, in order to ensure that these do not develop botulism, because cucumbers are a vegetable. They are not acidic. So the only safe way to water bath can them is in a pickled format. And if you're using canning recipes that are old family pickle recipes, or maybe it's an older canning book from like pre-1995, vinegar strength used to be 7%. And so the standard of vinegar now is 5%, but we're going to talk about that because there has recently been some vinegar hitting the shelves that's only been 4%. And the reason you need to know that is because when you are canning, all of the updated canning recipes have been formulated using 5% vinegar. So if you use a vinegar that is lower than that, you are actually not going to be within that safe zone for it being a safe product. And we need it to be in that acidity range because botulism doesn't grow in an acidic environment. So it's actually very important from a safety standpoint. So 5% vinegar is what you're after, and you can use white vinegar, you can use apple cider vinegar. When it comes to canning, I tend to prefer to use the white vinegar instead of a raw apple cider vinegar because the canning and heat process destroys all the benefits of a raw apple cider vinegar, and a good raw apple cider vinegar is more expensive than a white vinegar. Now, if you're trying to avoid GMO or gluten, some white vinegars are actually made from grains, so you'll want to check that out. And also from corn. And unfortunately, most of the corn in the US is a genetically modified grown crop. So I get my organic distilled white vinegar from Azure Standard, who is a sponsor of this video. But here's where vinegar percentages comes in and what you need to know. So Azure Standard's white vinegar is actually a little bit over 11%. So you could use this at full strength. It's not going to harm anything because you can always go stronger. More acidic is not a safety issue. However, the flavor of it might be really strong and not necessarily palatable. Plus, once we get this diluted down, it makes your vinegar go further, which is going to save you even more money. Now, if you're new to Azure Standard, a brand new customer, you can use the coupon code that we'll have below here in the video description, and that will get you 10% off your first order of $50 or more. So the great news is we can dilute this vinegar down to 5%. And so I have already done that, and we will have the written instructions on the blog post that accompanies this recipe, so you can quick and grab that. And then if you have this and it's 11% vinegar, then you will have the dilution rates already done for you based upon the amount that you need. So for today, I have done 3.5 cups of vinegar and 4.5 cups of water because this is 11% to get it to the 5%. So I've got 5 cups of vinegar and 5 cups water, and this is going to be the base of our brine. So kind of a rule of thumb, if you're ever using or seeing a pickling recipe and it's not at least equal parts vinegar and water, then that is an older recipe or not a safe, it could be a refrigerator recipe, but that is not a safe recipe for canning. It needs to be a minimum of equal parts vinegar and equal parts water. And if you're looking for the recipe we're using today is on page 206 of my book, Everything Worth Preserving, but I will have this recipe for you on the website as well. So next, we are going to be adding our salt. So I've got 5 tablespoons here, again, of the Redmond salt, and I do have a coupon code for this. This is the little shaker that I just keep in the counter that I cook with, or the cupboard. And then this is a 10-pound bucket, and I also get it in 25-pound bags because salt never goes bad. And as I said, this is the salt I use for everything, cooking, preserving, all the things. So we're gonna add this to our brine. And then a 1/4 cup sugar. Now the sugar is totally optional. It just kind of keeps that pucker punch down a little bit. So the sugar is not a safety thing. So you don't have to add the sugar, but most people find a small amount of sugar is going to just keep this right in that palatable range. So we're gonna go ahead and stir these. We wanna get that dissolved. And then we're going to bring this to a simmer, but now we need to talk about our spices because that is where you're going to get some of your flavoring as well as the garlic and dill, but that doesn't actually get added to our brine. So I have here, which is my favorite blend of pickling spices. So I've got celery seed, whole allspice, and whole black peppercorn. And this we are going to infuse into our brine. However, I don't really like having to pour hot liquid back through strainers or all of that. So I just use my large tea infuser, and I'm gonna go ahead and put in my pre-measured out pickling spice here. And then I just set this in and let this just infuse. And then all I have to do is just pull this out and it's easy. And then my brine is ready to go. So while that is coming to a simmer before we start our time to make sure it's infused for optimal flavor, now we want to go ahead and just start to heat up our steam canner. So I like to use a steam canner. It's really the only way I water bath can anymore. And I also like to do it for our pickles because I feel like it leaves the pickles crunchier using the steam canner than the full-on water bath. But it's a completely safe method to use for acidic recipes. So we just want to make sure that we have got the water in the base of our steam canner here is warm and beginning to heat up. So this has been infusing for 10 minutes and you can tell because the color has definitely changed. So I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna pull out our spice mix here. And then we're gonna just keep this nice and warm at a simmer while we finish prepping our jars. Okay, so now it's time to put our ingredients in our jars before we put our prepared brine over top of them. So I like to do 2 smashed cloves of garlic per quart jar, which we've already peeled and got those in there. And then comes our whole mustard seed. So again, this is per jar, and we are gonna do 2 teaspoons per quart. And then this is the next ingredient that helps keep your pickles crisp. And that is using something that has tannin in it. So these are grape leaves right from our grape plant. You can also use an oak leaf, horseradish leaf, all have tannins in them. Or you can put black tea in the spice and infuse that into your brine. And that will also add tannins to your brine and to your jar. And the purpose of this is the tannins are going to help keep your pickles nice and crunchy. So we've now got that, and then we've got our dill. So I have dill galore outside in the garden. So I am just using the fresh dill heads, and I like to do 2 or 3 heads of fresh dill. So kind of how I do it is if I have a really large head, then I'm going to count this kind of like as 2, and then I'll just do a large one and then a smaller one and count that good. If I just have a bunch of smaller heads of dill, then I'll go ahead and do 3. I like to have a really pronounced dill flavor. I love the flavor of dill, but this is really just kind of to your preference. You can do a little bit less, a little bit more. And if you don't have the fresh dill heads, you can use the dried dill seed and or dill weed. And I will have those, they're in the recipe in the book, but we'll also make sure we put those for you on the printable recipe that you can grab at the website. So now we need to get our cucumbers into our jars. Now I know a lot of you are always on the hunt for sources to get canning supplies, including canning jars, as well as canning lids. And these are the brand new canning jars from Azure Standard. So I'm super excited to be testing these out. These are regular mouth. You can use regular mouth for canning. When you're doing pickles, wide mouth is usually preferred because it's easier to get your hand, or at least mine, all the way into the jar. But you absolutely can still use the regular mouth. So super excited to use these. It was a little bit interesting. I don't know if you can see next to a different brand. Probably won't show up on camera, but they have a slight green tint to them, which I actually love because it's reminiscent of the old canning jars. And a lot of people are familiar with like the turquoise, the old ball jars that were turquoise and are antique. Green was more rare, but there are old antique green mason jars. So I kind of love that these are slightly tinted with the green. They just feel kind of reminiscent of those older vintage ones. Okay, time to get our cucumbers into our prepped jars here. So these have all been rinsed and draining. And kind of how I like to do it is I like to start with the largest cucumbers first and put those in at the base. And I put them in with these larger guys up and down rather, because I'm not gonna be able to fit them on their side, right? So I go ahead and put these vertically. And so I do that first, and I'm gonna take all of the large ones and get them in here first. And then where I get where I'm not sure I can fit one in, that's where I start to take these smaller ones and kind of push them down in there. And sometimes you can just kind of shift them a little bit like that, and you'll get them to move just enough where you can get another one in. See, on this one, I'm actually gonna go ahead and use the skinny end. It's kind of a little bit like playing Tetris. Pickle Tetris. And then go ahead and top these off. And I actually find when it comes to processing your cucumbers, I love a good sliced pickle, where you slice them, lengthways into the spears, or if you do them like bread and butter, where you do them more kind of like a potato chip. However, when they're in their whole format like this, then because they're larger, it's still completely safe to do them in this manner. But I find that they stay crunchier. So I would rather have a crunchy pickle that I slice up at the time of serving rather than soggy ones that are already pre-sliced for me. So a 1/2 inch is what we're going to do with these. However, if we have a little bit of space here, but I don't have any more cucumbers, that is still fine because we're gonna be filling to that 1/2 inch headspace with our prepared brine. So I always like to leave a generous 1 inch headspace with the solids, and then we're gonna top to a 1/2 inch headspace with our prepared brine, which you can see here is still really hot and steaming, so proceed with caution. And you always wanna make sure that your jars are on a towel that's folded in thirds, so you're not putting hot liquid into a jar. These have just been washed in hot soapy water, so these are still warm, but onto the countertop at room temperature. You can get thermal shock and actually crack your jars. And then we are going to take our debubbler here, and you're just gonna run this around the outside, and you can see little air bubbles that are coming up. We wanna make sure that we get those removed. And then we're gonna go ahead and recheck our headspace. See, now I need to add a little bit more brine. Boom, there we go. And we're gonna wipe our rim clean. And when you buy the jars from Azure with the bands and the lids, you get these with the Superb brand canning lids. We're gonna go ahead and get that on and then tighten these down to fingertip tight. And that's still pretty hot. And then we're gonna go ahead and put these in the prepared steam canner and then do our next jar. Okay, so now we need to bring this up to temp. So if you're doing this with a water bath, that's when the water reaches a full roiling boil that you would put the lid on a water bath canner and start your processing time. With a steam canner, we need to bring this up so that it shows on our indicator knob that this little dial reaches for our altitude, the middle section into the green. So mine still has a little bit to go for the zone. I'm the darker green because I'm only about 600 and something feet above sea level, so definitely not high altitude canning, before we start our processing time. Processing time for quartz in this recipe is 15 minutes. If you have leftover brine, don't worry. You can let this cool down to room temperature, put it in a jar and store it in the fridge, and it'll be fine in the fridge for at least up to a week. And I like to do that during canning season just because I usually have enough cucumbers comes in every few days to do a run like this. And then I will just bring this right back up to temperature and can use it. The other thing with doing your pickling brine is if you run out of brine, if you don't actually have enough brine for the jars that you are doing, you can't just add hot water, because if you're adding water, then you are lowering the acidity of that brine. So you need to make sure that you have enough. And if you don't, then you have to heat up and bring to a boil another batch of brine in order to equal what you are short on. So I wanted to show you guys using this recipe. These are pickles that I canned, and actually this jar is from 2 years ago because apparently I went a little hog wild and canned way more pickles than we could eat in a year. So I didn't actually can pickles last year. I'm getting them canned this year because now we're finally getting low. So, and yes, if home canned food is done correctly and stored correctly, it is safe to eat 2 years down the road. Best nutritional value is going to be within 12 months, but you just get marginal loss, and I'm not about to throw out wonderfully delicious garlic dill pickles. So this, you can see we actually sliced some spears because this is our working jar in the fridge. But I want to show you texture. So see, like I'm moving this a little bit. You're never going to have a pickle as firm as a fresh pickle that you've just picked out of the garden, because it does go through a cooking process as it's canning and when you pour that hot boiling brine on top of it. But it absolutely can still have crunch factor. Case in point. It's still crunchy and delicious. So we stopped our processing time at 15 minutes, and then with the steam canner, you let it stay with the lid on an additional 5 minutes before removing the lid. And that's where it's a little bit different than the water bath. With the water bath canner, you stop your processing time and then you remove the lid and wait 5 minutes before removing the jars. So I'm gonna let these sit for just a few minutes before taking them off the hot steam and putting them over here on our towel. So it's been 5 minutes, so we are going to move these over to our prepared towel. We're gonna let these sit for 12 to 24 hours, and then we will check the seals before putting them into storage, as well as labeling them. Now, I know I just showed this as a canned garlic dill pickle recipe, but you absolutely could just do these as a refrigerator pickle, not process them, and then put them in the fridge, especially if you only have like enough to do one jar. And if you want to have a bread and butter pickle recipe, because you really do, you need more than one pickle recipe in your life, go and check out this video here.